So my name is Lance. I'm a product specialist here at LabKey. So let me go ahead and share my screen really fast. So I'm super excited to kind of learn more about all of the different types of science that we help support, especially with Sample Manager. Um, so today I'm going to kind of discuss what I've learned from kind of being onboarded from Sample Manager since I started back last year in August to how it would have helped with my personal experiences, and how we can further help you with kind of spring cleaning, making sure your lab is kind of staying organized and how Sample Manager can help out with that. But before we really go into that, I kind of want to explain how you can kind of reach out and get some more help with Sample Manager should you run into anything. Um, so for Sample Manager, we're releasing a new support ticket system. This is where you can email help@labkey.com. And we can help out from anything from new projects, labs, or users. We can help migrate some of your old data, train new users, or if you have any questions on how we can better support you, maybe you want to learn more about new features like our workflow or our ELN. That's something that we can totally help out with. And this ticket system is in a shared inbox. So if I'm out of town, if Hannah's out of town, we'll always have someone having eyes on it. And this is also a great way for you if you have any feedback or questions. If there's certain features that you want, we'd love to hear your opinions. And this is a great way for you to kind of speak with us so we can learn more about what you're missing and what we can do moving forward. So right now, this is only for Sample Manager as we try out how this ticket system works. If you're with LabKey's SDMS, you'll still have your support portal as per usual. But we're excited to be able to grow in our support. But now that you know how to reach out, I also want to introduce myself for those who may not have worked with me before. Again, my name is Lance. I'm a product specialist here at LabKey. I'm here to help prospects, new clients, and existing clients with basically all things Sample Manager. And like Hannah kind of alluded to earlier, we like to hire people that are from science. And before LabKey, I worked at a zoo, I worked at an emergency veterinary clinic, and then I've also worked in human organ and tissue donation. And at these places, I was recording my samples using a variety of different methods from pen and paper to Excel, LIMS, or a combination of all three of those systems. So I'm very familiar with a lot of the challenges that these systems bring. But that's why I'm so excited to see how Sample Manager has been able to take a lot of those challenges and further improve on them. Uh, and really, it's just an amazing software that I wish I had when I was at a lot of these other places. Um, and this kind of brings me to an archive project I worked at with one of my previous jobs. With this project, I needed to organize and dispose of over 100,000 samples. It was a huge overtaking that started all the way back in 2007 and went until 2023. So this project took a very long time. I tackled it in 2021 to try and solve it, just to try to make sure we can get rid of these samples that we no longer needed. Throughout this project, I was using a combination of three different limbs, bunch of different spreadsheets, all with different formatting, and written records. So it was very challenging trying to combine all of these systems into one centralized system. And that ran into quite a few issues. The first challenge was that there was missing data between all of these different records. Each records had a different set of different data fields. So one of them would have like a sample ID and then where that sample came from a specific patient. And then others would be like, this patient needs these samples disposed of. So it was very challenging trying to figure out exactly which samples to get rid of and how they all matched up with one another. And from that, I had to cross-reference all of these different spreadsheets, these different limbs, written records, multiple times just to figure out what I was looking at. And it took a very long time to do. And not only that, but some of the data was outdated, particularly where these samples were stored. And because the vast majority of these samples were in a historic LIMS or in an Excel spreadsheet, that only myself and IT had access to, the lab techs couldn't check these boxes in and out of freezers. So it was very challenging trying to figure out where these boxes were. And one day I would go into the freezer, do an entire shelf of samples. It's like, great, I don't have to go back to the shelf. But then the next day they had to move boxes around. So I kind of had to start it from scratch. I ended up having to mark these boxes with Sharpies just to try to signal, hey, I already worked on this box. I don't need to come back to it. So not only did that cause a lot of issues, but it took a lot of time as well. And finally, what was sort of a marriage of all of these issues was that it was super challenging kind of searching through these samples to try to pull a list of what I needed to dispose of. I couldn't just say, I need to look at these 3 patients and pull up all these samples. I would have to go through each one of these samples one by one to try to figure out exactly where they came from. And then it was also very difficult to track which samples had been disposed of because they weren't in centralized limbs. I was going through a bunch of different records and Excel spreadsheets. So that was also very difficult to kind of keep track and audit everything. Um, and now, about after a month of me working on this project that took well over a year of me going through freezers, I learned about Sample Manager. And I was amazed how all of these problems could have been addressed with the software. If I had Sample Manager, this project would have taken me well over a year to weeks, or even just a couple of months with just the large volume I had to go through. So I think moving forward, it's important that folks use Sample Manager to its fullest so they can kind of tackle these really daunting projects and helping keep track of where these samples are that you need to dispose of, and just make sure that you know exactly where everything is going. And there's quite a few ways that I think Sample Manager could have helped. Especially like with that missing data, Sample Manager could have combined all of the information into one centralized location. So you don't have to look at wide range of spreadsheets or a bunch of different limbs. It's all in one place. So that makes it super easy. And it could have as much or as little data as needed. So when I had all those different data fields, I could have combined them all into one place. That way I could really search through all my samples and register them to have that data. And one problem that I did also have when I was working through this problem is that I couldn't migrate all of these really old samples into our current limbs because it would have charged a client a wide or huge amount of money, which is something we didn't want to do. So we couldn't put those into the limbs. But with Sample Manager, we could have done that without it impacting our current data. We could have either used a folder if I wanted to keep these samples separate under an archive project, or I could just add them all under one place and not necessarily link them to a specific client or a billing profile. So that would have been super helpful for me to kind of make sure all of these samples were together for the lab moving forward. Um, and then really when these samples were moving, I could check them in and out of our freezers very quickly within Sample Manager. And Sample Manager, you can check out an entire shelf or an entire rack or an entire freezer into another location. So I would always have up-to-date information on where these samples were. And this would have been super useful when they needed to defrost a freezer and I didn't come back and wonder, oh no, where did my samples go? They're right here. It's totally fine. And finally, searching in Sample Manager would have been super easy. I'd be able to pull a list of all my samples disposed of based off of the specific data that their source was linked to. And this would have made it so much easier to track the sample life cycle and know exactly which samples I had already disposed of as well. And this would have made us more readily able to report to the client exactly what samples they had remaining. So now kind of knowing how Sample Manager could have helped me and how it might be able to help you with some of your projects, how do you get there? And that's where spring cleaning really begins with Sample Manager. And the step one with kind of spring cleaning is data organization. And this is something that we want to do really when we're first setting up Sample Manager, but it's always something you want to revisit to see how you can make improvements to your workflow, or maybe if you're tackling on new projects, new sample types, or if you just want to grow with your use of Sample Manager. And don't worry, this is something that you don't have to do alone. This is something we can do for you or with you based on our experience and what you're needing and what we think may work best for you. And that's when we can really work together. So how do you organize your data in Sample Manager? This can be done on a bunch of different levels. On our top level is our source, and a source is really an indication of where a sample comes from. It could be from a specific study, specific patient, or maybe a specific species of bacteria or an animal. And on this level, we want to have a data field to indicate whether or not the samples from the source can be discarded. Maybe this is something like a patient has deconsented, a study was canceled, and whatnot. And this would just say, hey, all of these samples can now be disposed of. And with this, for the source level, we can also track the lineage and see how many samples each source has. This is useful if you're only needing to retain a certain amount of samples per source. Maybe for a patient, you only need one serum and one plasma, but then the rest of your samples you can discard of. So this is a great way for us to kind of capture that information. And then next, we can capture data on our sample level. This is where we can set expiration dates or dates to discard of these samples. And this can help track exactly when these samples should be disposed of. We can capture the volume of what remains in our samples. This is something we really want you to prompt, or we prompt when you're checking samples back into storage. We ask how much you used during your experiment. And this is really so you can track of, hey, we ran out of volume in the sample. Maybe we don't need to retain an empty vial anymore. And then also we can track things like sample quality. Maybe you don't want to hold on to samples that are severely homolyzed. This is really important if you won't ever have any use of these samples. Why are you holding on to it unless it is for a regulatory requirement? And then finally, we can also capture data on our assay level. This can help us capture test results, and there are certain thresholds that can indicate whether a sample can be disposed. Maybe you want to dispose of samples that come back as negative for certain tests, or mark samples that are positive so you can kind of mark them and lock them for a quality control check. And then, of course, if certain samples have tests results that are between this like 0 to 1 for maybe carbon levels, you may hold on to them or you may discard them, really depending on how your workflow works. And as we're capturing all this data, it's super important to realize that we are tracking all of these changes that you're making to the system. We keep track of the samples that from the moment you register it to when we dispose of it. So our audit log is always going to be there as a backup, so you can go back and look, why did we dispose of these samples? Was there a specific reason? Who did it and why did they do it? And then, of course, in one of our most recent updates in Sample Manager, we can enforce specific reasons for certain events. So when someone is discarding a sample, they will have to type in a reason of why they're getting rid of something. So if an auditor comes in, why did you dispose of these samples? We have that reason right there. So now that we can organize our data in a very useful way, we need a way to pull a list of samples based off of that data. And that's where Sample Finder really comes useful and is probably the top feature that would have helped me during my project. This would have saved me so much time, so much energy, and is something that I think more users should be aware of and be using pretty actively if they're going to be doing something like discarding of their samples. In Sample Finder, you can pull a list of samples based on the data fields from their sources. So this is where I can have a bunch of different fields for my patient. Maybe I need to see if a patient deconsented, if they are positive for a certain disease, or maybe they're a non-donor, like if I'm an organ and tissue donation. And this could also be if I'm looking for a specific animal species or a herd too, to dispose of samples. Regardless of the field, it's super fast and it's an easy way to do this powerful search to pull all of my samples that meet that specific data requirements. I'm able to run these searches based off of my sources, my parent samples, and different assays. So we keep all those data fields available for you. But we also have saved searches based off of when your samples are expiring. So if I run a lot of these searches a lot, I can save these searches, or I can go into these other reports we already have for you to say, I want to see all my samples that are expiring in 7 days, pull that report and generate a new list of samples. And when I do run one of my save searches, do a brand new search, I'll pull a list of samples that meet that criteria. I can further narrow it down with more fields or with different columns in the sample grid. But if I'm happy with what I have, I can then find where these samples are in storage. I can download them into an Excel spreadsheet to take with me to the freezers and kind of dig through my boxes there. Or I can share this list with others. In this list, I can also add these samples to a pick list if I need to reference them later on. I can pull them and move them from my storage, add them to our workflow job, add essays to them, whatever it is that I need to do. But regardless, Sample Manager makes it super easy to pull a list of samples based off of how I organize my data with Sample Finder. And again, this alone would have saved me months of work with my archive project and hopefully saves quite a bit of time for when you're working in Sample Manager. Now that I'm able to organize my data and now that I can find the samples we need to pull, it's time to talk about probably one of the most dreaded lab events, and that is freezer maintenance. That is always something that I felt like when I was working in the lab made us kind of want to put it off, but it's something that we had to do pretty regularly. And there's a few ways that we can make freezer maintenance much easier with Sample Manager and kind of going beyond Sample Manager. So kind of looking at our samples, we want to make sure that we're using barcodes if we're working with a very large quantity of samples. This can help streamline with sorting these samples with those barcodes so you can scan them as you're working with them. Um, and in Sample Manager, we can support either barcodes that are already labeled on your samples, or we can print them from Sample Manager using another third-party software. So this can help make sure you're going very quickly with your samples as you're checking them in and out, or you're just kind of scanning them as you pull up that list of samples. And when you are labeling your samples, we want to make sure that we're covering them with clear tape. Clear Scotch tape, I think, works the best in my experience to ensure that these labels aren't coming off in freezers. I know sometimes some water will get underneath the label and then it'll come off the sample. So trying to prevent that is very useful so you know exactly which type of sample you're looking at. And then when making changes in Sample Manager, you'll also likely want to enforce comments. This is, again, one of our brand new features that you can change in the administration settings. And these are when we have reasons for why certain events were taken. If a quality event comes up or if a sample isn't where you expect it to be, these comments can make the investigation much easier. So you know, hey, why was the sample taken out of storage? Maybe it was for this experiment or we're running these tests on these samples, and that's why they're not where we expect them to be. So always going back to your audit log if something comes up is going to be very useful in Sample Manager. And then using pick lists can also help keep track of which samples you and your team need to work on so you can go back to that list and reference them. This is especially useful if you're needing to go in and out of your freezers. Maybe the freezer is getting warm, so you can't pull all of those samples that you wanted from before, but you can come back to later once your freezer gets time to kind of reestablish its temperature. So this right here is kind of an example of what this pick list looks like. We can keep all of these samples listed in one location for you to reference back on, but you can also share it with other people that will be working in Sample Manager. From the freezer side of kind of freezer management, making sure we're keeping our freezers up to where they need to be, it helps to regularly go through your samples and keeping only what you need in your freezers so they don't get cluttered. This can help make sure that we're not blocking the fans in the freezer so we have enough air circulation going. Of course, if these fans get blocked, this can cause the temperatures to drop and maybe your samples don't stay frozen inside of the freezer. Keeping up with your regular maintenance can also ensure your freezers don't die on you. Most manufacturers recommend you defrost your freezers at least once a year. So with doing that, you'll want to make sure you move all of your samples out of the freezer and into another temporary location while you clean your freezer out, allow it to completely defrost. But when you're doing this in Sample Manager, you can use different freezer statuses. And this is where you can say if freezer's active, it's defrosting, or it's currently a backup freezer. So this can help let the lab know, hey, we can't check any samples into this freezer right now while it's defrosting. So you need to check your samples into another location. And while a sample is also defrosting, we make it really easy to move an entire location within your freezer to another spot. So you can move an entire rack or an entire shelf to another location, keep all of your boxes and samples together so you don't have to move one box at a time. This can really help streamline your process and make freezer maintenance a little bit less painful. And then, of course, you want to make sure you're not opening and closing your freezers a lot. So if you're using a large quantity of samples, maybe across different boxes, we found that using dry ice in a bucket can really help your samples maintain their temperatures that they need to, so you're not kind of risking your freezers going offline. Of course, when you're doing that, just make sure you're using proper PPE. So to summarize, Sample Manager would have saved me so much time on my archive project, and hopefully it's going to be helping you all save time on your different projects. And of course, this project that I worked on went from years to a couple of months with Sample Manager. So Sample Manager can help you too. It's important to make sure you're organizing your data in certain ways that will be useful for you to kind of pull that data in a queryable way. So then you can dispose of your samples really easily and in a very quick way. And of course, when you're disposing your samples, you're not keeping things you don't need. This also helps maintaining your samples in your freezers a lot easier. So you can hopefully make spring cleaning a little bit less of a huge mountain to climb and a little bit be easier. So you don't kind of run into any of those issues that I ran into. So if you want some help with maintaining your freezers, with all of your spring cleaning with Sample Manager, we're here to help you. We want to make sure that anything that seems like it might be a big challenge for you to tackle, we can provide advice, support, or help you kind of better use Sample Manager to your advantage. And there's a bunch of different ways for you to contact us or to learn more. Like I kind of spoke at the beginning, you can email help@labkey.com, and that will go to a shared inbox where multiple people will be monitoring it, so we'll be able to respond fairly quickly. But you can also go to our blog and kind of read some different either case studies or ways Sample Manager can help you out. We have our YouTube playlists, so these have different tutorials on how to do certain things within Sample Manager, but we also post all of our case study, client presentations, and user conferences on there as well. So you can go there and watch those different videos. We have our support docs, which if you're in Sample Manager, if you've seen that question mark in the upper right-hand corner, that's where you can easily get to those from Sample Manager. Schedule a meeting with us, and we'd be more than happy to meet with you, discuss what your needs are, and kind of go from there. So I guess now I'll kind of go over any questions that may have popped up. So it looks like, what is the recommended mechanism to spot check the samples? Well, one comment by Vile, is there a plan to add comments on a box, bag, or container level? Yeah, so that is a great question. Right now, you can have kind of labels in the boxes if you have a specific kind of container that's there, so you can go by those labels. But again, I think going through your audit log to kind of spot check those samples is always going to be super useful. And it looks like the lab team would like to answer that question live. But I think that's a great comment on the box and bag container level. So we'll kind of keep that in mind going from there.
Yeah, I'd say actually we've heard this a couple times, and so definitely the request again is helpful. But yeah, being able to provide better support for sort of that spot checking. I know people now are sort of using the pick list mechanism for that. But we all are already sort of talking about how we might be able to add comments to boxes for that purpose as well.
Mhm. How long does it typically say to migrate to a system to Sample Manager? And I'm going to combine it with another question. What support do we get to ensure success? So that is a great question. And some of it kind of depends on what your data actually looks like. If it's a lot of data that we need to do some cleanup, it's going to take a little bit more time as compared to data that's fairly clean that doesn't need a lot of editing. Typically, we say migration takes 4 to 8 weeks, depending on that. And that's where we really support you. We can get your historical data into Sample Manager, so you don't really have to worry about doing that cleanup. We can help you do it. And we also provide training on Sample Manager, make sure that you know exactly how to use the system. And we really help you get updated and kind of just fully onboarded in the system. And after that implementation process, we make sure that we're always here for you for your support. So if you do need additional training, if any issues come up, we're always here to help you out. And that's true too if you are a current Sample Manager user, we can definitely do that for you, especially if you have new labs, new sets of data that you need to import. We're always here for you. So I guess I answered that a little bit. Is implementation an extra cost? So it's typically not an extra cost. We do that for you. We haven't charged anyone for that implementation. I think the only time we would ever do that is if we have to fly out to your laboratory and do that for you, but we haven't seen a need for that. Right. And I'm gonna go ahead and double check the chat. Great. So if you have any other questions, I'd be more than happy to help out. Again, you can always email us and kind of get some more support that way. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to, I think, Hannah, who will introduce our new speaker.